go.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for handing over to me. Very warm welcome also from my side. I'm happy to see so many people around, I guess from all around the world. I'm myself based in Germany at the moment, so for me it's a good evening. Yeah, my name is Claudia Bieling, and I will guide you as the host through this seminar today. And let me briefly introduce myself to you. I'm a professor for societal transition and agriculture at University of Hohenheim in southern Germany. My work focuses on the interface between ecological and social dimensions in land use and food systems. And since a couple of years, I'm also very happy to serve as a member of the editorial board of Conservation Letters. And in that function, I was very, very happy to have had on my desk this paper we will hear more about today. It's a paper that uses behavioral and communication sciences in order to come up with some very interesting insights on how we can promote conservation behavior among private landowners. I think this paper is extremely relevant. It's extremely interesting in many regards, and I want to mention just a few points here. So one thing is that this paper bridges different disciplines in a quite innovative way, and it also has very clear implications for conservation practice. And as a basis for this, and this is another one of the strong points about this paper, it provides very rich empirical data, and we have very, very little on this actually. It does so by running a large test on the effects of different ways of framing messages for promoting conservation agriculture. I will stop here to talk about the paper and leave it to the lead author of this paper. Please welcome Sheila Reddy here in our round. She will present this paper with the title Conservation Behavior and Effects of Economic and Environmental Message Frames. It's a paper which has recently been published online in Conservation Letters, and it's not, it's in press yet at the moment. So a few words also on Sheila, of course, who's the main person today. She's working for the Nature Conservancy. She is Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Chief Strategy Office there. She has a background in biology, holds a PhD in marine biology, but she always stretches out to other fields also, for instance, economics. And also in her work with the Nature Conservancy, she bridges different perspectives, for instance, by using remote sensing and artificial intelligence for measuring conservation impact. Or as another example, by supporting conservation strategy development through economics and other behavioral sciences. One thing she will probably report upon today is that her team is running large field experiments to test new ways to promote conservation practices on US farmlands. And with this, I would like to hand over to Sheila. But before we do this, also a notice for the audience. If you have questions while listening to the talk of Sheila, then please note these questions down in the chat box. And I will keep an eye on that. And later we will have a discussion, questions and answers. And I will go back to what I find in the chat box for this. I invite you to turn your cameras off now while we have the talk. Later for the discussion, it would be very nice to actually see your faces also. And in any case, I would ask you to now all mute your micro if it's not done yet. And with this, Sheila, I hand over to you. The virtual floor is yours. We are looking forward to your talk.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to acknowledge that this is a collaborative effort, as you can see, amongst people from the Nature Conservancy, Purdue University, and Johns Hopkins University. And I'll be talking to you about this paper that Claudia mentioned in the context of a broader effort to use fail fast, learn faster approaches, as we're calling them, to designing new conservation programs. And I'm pleased to have a few of my co-authors here with me, Colin Weigel, Pranay Ranjan, and Linda Prokopi. and a few may be joining a little bit later as well. So they'll be available to add perspective and help answer some questions during the Q&A at the end or throughout if you have them. So let me get started. I'm going to put it really plainly, and that is that we have failed to meet a single 2020 target to stop the destruction of nature under the Convention on Biological Diversity. I imagine most all of you saw this news in September, and while in some ways it wasn't totally new, it's really sobering. We just can't wait another 10 years to figure out that we perhaps might fail again. So if we're going to fail, I posit that we have to fail fast and learn faster so that we can get to solutions. This is what we're here about. This is what the Nature Conservancy is trying to do. And so we need to start doing things differently. So what I'm going to try to share with you today is this idea that faster learning can lead to greater progress. So currently, most of the time, in reality, we are using a pretty linear process where learning is really slow or almost non-existent. That's what I'm showing here on the left-hand side. We understand the problem, we generate an idea, we take some action, but we're not necessarily integrating a lot of testing or learning. Like what we want to be doing on the right-hand side is more of an innovation approach, an adaptive management approach, where we're more rapidly generating ideas, testing them, learning, and adjusting. And of course, this is not anything new. Conservationists are quite familiar, of course, with adaptive management. And in the private sector, innovation approaches have been advocated for and used for quite some time. But I'll say that, speaking from my own experience at the Nature Conservancy and in other aspects of conservation, we're still just not that great at doing this right-hand side approach. And even when we do it, we don't do it as fast as we probably need to, given where we are in terms of achieving our global goals for nature. So today I want to focus on one of these big, complex challenges that does need innovation. And that's the challenge in the Mississippi River Basin of elevated nutrients, sediments, and for that matter, degrading soils. So we know that pollution from agriculture and cities is impairing waterways and has led to a large dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's been billions of dollars poured into conservation programs in this region, including money spent by the Nature Conservancy. And yet conservation practices are just stubbornly low in this region. So we really need to innovate and come up with some new solutions to move the needle. So when we were taking a hard look at our agricultural strategies in the Mississippi River Basin at the Nature Conservancy, as we often do, we started looking at maps and we had an insight. It's shown here on the left-hand side. Turns out that the majority of priority areas for nutrient pollution in the Mississippi River Basin are rented farmland. So that's the area shown in the dark brown here. And it turns out that on these rented farmland, conservation practices are lower. So they're lower when the person who owns the land is not the person who operates the farm. And in fact, they're even lower when the landowner doesn't share in the costs of operating the farm. And that's shown with the blue bar in the graph on the right-hand side. So this insight led us to what became, you could say, our initial hypothesis. Could we make more progress by focusing more on these landowners who have not traditionally been the focus of conservation programs, and in particular, their relationships with their operators and how those get formalized into lease agreements. Now, I wouldn't have a lot to talk to you about today if we simply came up with that idea and started to roll out a program focused on these landowners and lease agreements. But the good news was that at that time, we had a special science innovation fund at the Nature Conservancy that allowed us to take a different approach, the one shown here, where we're trying to test, learn, adjust, and do this more rapidly, and do this with a cross-sector team, some of whom are on the call today. So I won't go into all of the details of all the smaller informal tests that we did as we started to launch this program, roll it out, figure it out, adjust it, learn, redo things, do it again. Oh, but the good news is that's being captured in a paper that Chloe Wardroper, one of the former postdocs on the project, is preparing to submit soon. So I think it's going to be an important thing to share out. But instead, what I'll do is I'll focus on two main experiments that we conducted. First, around engaging these hard to reach landowners, non-operating landowners is what we call them. And then a main experiment around offering them some different forms of assistance. So our first step in after we launched the program was that understanding step. Understanding and refining our hypotheses about why it was that we aren't getting conservation practices at higher levels on these lands. And so this involved additional literature review, conducting interviews. And what emerged from that were 5 different barriers to conservation on rented lands shown here on the left. Some of them not surprising, but some of them very specific to rented lands. So of course, information deficits, misaligned incentives between the landowner and the operator, but also over time, these lease terms that are single-year leases and don't necessarily include covering a cost for conservation practices, and really interesting issues around cultural and interpersonal challenges and power dynamics between operators and landowners, sometimes even related to gender. And then lastly, rental market dynamics. And so we focused in on 4 of these barriers because they were susceptible to interventions that we could implement as a trial program or even just as the Nature Conservancy. And then we designed specific interventions to address these barriers. You could think of these as our refined hypotheses. And we did that by focusing on the 3 different main behavior change approaches that you see in the behavioral sciences literature and practice. And those around promoting awareness and concern, incentivizing behavior. These are both sort of along the rational reasoning pathway, and then using nudges. So just trying to make it easier to get to conservation and tapping into intuition. So I'll get into the specifics of these interventions as we get into the experiment. But before we could even run the randomized control trial, we of course had to actually enroll people. And these are farmland owners that don't necessarily live at the farm, they live all over the country. They're not necessarily one homogeneous group. We don't know a lot about them. And so we had to try and get them interested. So we started off by actually sending mailers to 1/3 of the population, over 40,000 of them in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. But of course, because we were trying to take this innovation approach, we thought, well, we ought to use this as an opportunity to test what actually does promote more interest from these landowners. And so we focused in on the idea of testing commonly used message frames. So in this context, it's really commonplace to focus on the economic or environmental benefits of doing conservation practices on farmland, and in particular, the win-win economic and environmental benefits. But in reality, these message frames are really rarely tested. We don't know if they work. And so that's what we set out to do. As you can see here in this image, on the left-hand side, we have our 2 message frames. So what I'm showing you are the front cover of the mailers that people received. And then the interior was structurally the same, but then some of the language, of course, was framed differently. In contrast to our control, which was a simple informational message, just asking this question about what is soil health and offering some explanation of that. So what did we find? Well, it turns out that framing did not improve the response from landowners. And this is really important because it's showing that the common wisdom of message framing, using these message frames that are widely used in this particular context, is not supported by our evidence. And even more interestingly and importantly, we found that when you focus in on this critical subpopulation of landowners who have not used conservation practices, in particular cover crops, that the economic frame actually reduced responses. And this is really critical because these are the folks that we want to get to be adopting conservation practices. And what we're seeing is that if we hadn't tested this and we went with the common wisdom, we might have been even less likely to get them enrolled in our program. So why might it be that this economic message frame reduced responses and enrollment in our program? So these are the people who aren't already using conservation practices or never have used them. Well, according to what we know about them, they hadn't used any in the last 3 years. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that this subpopulation doesn't believe in the economic benefits as indicated by the fact that they're not adopting these conservation practices. And so by providing a informational mailer or message, we were simply just asking them to take an easy first step of learning more. We weren't risking conflicting with their worldview and asking them to change their beliefs. In addition, again, because they wouldn't necessarily believe that there are economic benefits from conservation, they may have seen our message as not credible because they're looking around saying, well, I don't see the benefits. I'm not necessarily seeing my neighbors getting better, doing these practices. Why should I believe that, especially coming from, say, the Nature Conservancy, that there are benefits of these practices? And so I emphasize that as well, that we may have been the wrong messenger for an economic message about cover crops. And you could also imagine too that coming from the Nature Conservancy, an environmental organization, they might have kind of been scratching their head at, well, gosh, why are you focusing on the economic benefits when your goals are around the environment? There may have been a lack of trust created by not being straightforward about a primary goal of environmental action. So what was great about that step was we learned a lot. We learned about how these common message frames actually don't necessarily result in the improvements that you would hope. And sure, that cost us a little bit in terms of enrollment, but we still got a response rate of, on average, of 11%, which allowed us to enroll nearly 4,000 landowners in our trial who control nearly 2 million acres across the program area shown here. So now that we had these landowners enrolled in the program, we randomly assigned them to one of 3 treatments. So the first was receiving an information packet. The second was the information packet plus an example lease language, or almost like a lease template for them to work with their operator to include cover crops in the lease with different options for sharing costs. And then lastly, those first 2 treatments plus a $1,500 financial incentive. So here's 2 photos of the front and back of the mailer. So you can see some, nice glossy photos here, big font, our logos, importantly on the back, logos of our advisory group that are local and trusted. And like I said, again, I'm not sharing with you all the details about how we came to these designs, but in Chloe's paper, you'll see a lot of what we learned through focus groups, for example, where we initially showed early drafts of some of these mailers. I'll recount one story where we did that, and we had an image of someone in a soybean field. Actually, I think I may have been showing it earlier. And the non-operating farmland owners who were in that focus group said, well, gosh, those soybeans look really unhealthy. I wouldn't want to sign up for a program that's advocating for that. And that was part of how we ended up switching to the soil imagery instead. So all the landowners received these packets, and then what varied was the contents inside. So they were tailored to the location. They had this call to action letter about taking 3 steps to work with your operator to adopt cover crops. And then they varied in terms of whether they got the lease template or the financial incentive in addition. And so after we ran the trial and the cover crop planting season was over, we were able, through remote sensing data, to find out that, in fact, these 3 different treatments did not make a difference, or we could not detect a difference in the adoption of cover crops amongst these groups. So we had approximately 6% adopting cover crops across all 3 treatments. And I'll note that it was really important that this remote sensing data on cover crops actually became available right around the time that we were working on this, because it gave us an objective measure of cover crop adoption across all landowners enrolled in the trial. Whereas if we had to rely on survey responses alone, we would have had biased estimates in our outcomes. So this is a really important advancement for doing large scale tests. That said, the survey was very helpful in terms of providing insights on where people made progress along their path towards adoption, and where they continued to run into barriers. So that gives us a few more insights into, well, why didn't we see a difference? Why wasn't this enough? What else might be needed? So, for example, originally in the design of the trial, we had wanted to include technical assistance. And while we can't say a lot about whether that would help or not, we do know that we were limited in not being able to offer that in terms of budget and logistics, and that this is a new practice for a lot of these landowners and operators. And so, an additional hypothesis is, well, was it that they needed that as well? Can't say a lot about that, but what we do have some insights about is whether would more time have helped. So we did see from the survey that about 50% of landowners took at least one step towards adoption, meaning they talked to a family member, they talked to their operator, they reached out to a local extension professional to get some resources. So was this 1 year trial, not long enough? And that kind of emphasizes the tension between rapid testing and the fact that some processes take some time. And then lastly, you might think, well, did they need more money than $1,500? Well, we did have the opportunity to do a follow-up experiment with a smaller number of landowners where we offered $5,000. And we got a uptake rate of about 5%, so much higher than, or a good amount higher than our 1.5% for the $1,500. But 5% is still not exactly what you might hope for if you were going to invest a lot of money in a program. You'd be looking for, something more like 15% or 20%. And that brings me to the last result I want to leave you with. And that is that intentions don't always equal action. So I mentioned, if you were going to roll out a bigger program, you might hope that you'd get 15 to 20% of people taking up your offers and doing conservation as a result. And our survey suggested that farmers, based on their stated intentions, 16% of them would have taken the $1,500 offer. That's what they said, and that's what was implied by survey results. But when you actually did the test, only 1.5% did. And so I think this, amongst hopefully the other results that I've shared with you today, really do show that it is important to be testing, because the things that we may think are going to work with a program often can surprise us, even when we do have some evidence. So in sum, I'll share what I think are 7 of the top lessons that we learned from this. So first, innovation requires special funding, a team, and incentives. To break out of that traditional sort of linear approach where learning is slow or non-existent, you really do need to be quite intentional about it. You need to dedicate special funding for it. You need to make sure that you have the right people in place. And importantly, we recognized that we also needed all of the people on the team to not have their job essentially tied to the success of this program. That would be some misaligned incentive just on the part of the program, and put some barriers up for us in terms of learning and being willing to fail fast. Well, you also need to make sure that you do recognize the small successes, or large, depending on how you look at them, which is, we did learn how to engage non-operator landowners. Previously, these were considered really hard to reach people, and we learned some ways to engage them, and some ways to do it better, and some ways that didn't work as well. Specifically, we learned that the commonly used message frames actually didn't help. That simple "what is soil health" message did better, and that, in fact, for the subpopulation that we cared about, using the economic message frame actually decreased interest. So this was a real aha, and something that a lot of our marketing and strategic communications folks were very interested to see. And then, the hard lesson is that we started off with, this pretty exciting hypothesis about this missing population, but targeting them and offering these different forms of assistance, it turned out, it's not a silver bullet. We were able to use new technology to do this, to have a large, robust test to essentially do conservation at the same time that we do testing and learning. But, this will bring me to our sixth lesson, which is we started, this sort of evidence starts to make you wonder, are these voluntary programs insufficient? And that is something that's definitely worthy of more testing and investigation. And lastly, we do feel that the cost of all this testing was worth it in terms of avoiding wasting resources, avoiding putting a large amount of money into a new strategy that was untested, and waiting, for example, say 10 years to figure out whether it worked or not. So this has allowed us to figure out relatively quickly, how can we get some conservation on the ground? How do we learn while doing? And then how do we make some adjustments? So, like I said, this, not even everyone involved, of course, is listed here, but these are the core team that made this possible, with many different areas of expertise and experience that allowed us to take different perspectives into understanding the problem, rolling out real world tests, and then adjusting those lessons into the practices of a conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy. So with that, I want to say thank you all for being here today, and I'm really interested to have a discussion with you about what we found and how this sort of approach and these particular lessons might be applied to your work or in other contexts. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for this really wonderful presentation. I think it delivered a lot of food for thought, also some very clear lessons. And I'm also sure that we will have a vivid discussion now. It would be great if you could now stop screen sharing so that we can all see each other better. And I would also encourage each and all of you to now put your video on. It's much nicer to have some actual faces than just black screens when you're having a discussion. I received the first question in the chat already, and for all of you, I just want to mention, so there are different ways of how you can now engage on the discussion. So you can either go to the participants menu and then just press on that little button that you want to raise your hand. I will notice that. Or you could just drop question or comment in the chat room, and then I will again take this up, of course. So I will start with the question which came up already during Sheila's talk. Sheila, shall I read it out? Or Mark, maybe you want to address it directly to Sheila? So this is a question on these 3 different treatments you talked about.
Oh, sure, I can read. Hi, Sheila.
Hi, nice to see you.
It's really interesting. Just one little thing. I presume that you have considered alternative designs to the one that you took for the forms of assistance, A plus B, A plus B plus C, because you couldn't explore main effects. And you ended up asking that question, did they get enough money? I mean, you couldn't really look at that in isolation.
Right. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And gosh, it's bringing me back to many weeks and months of power analyses and negotiation and exploration of logistics. So, there's lots of pieces to the puzzle that you have to put together, which obviously the power analysis, your budget, your goals, whatnot. So we had initially looked at designs where we were going to look at mean and interactive effects, but then we thought with our budget and what it was going to cost to do these things, we didn't feel that we could do that. And so in this case, I'm trying to recollect all of the exact sequence of events, but that was our initial desire. But then we went to these combined designs, in part because the nudge, adding this lease template, is a very low cost, addition to the treatment with the financial incentive. And we didn't necessarily believe it was going to have a much, much larger effect than the financial incentive itself. And so we were sort of balancing, a desire to both learn and also get some conservation on the ground, because, this is being done in the context of, a regular organization who does have a mission to do some conservation. But I also have Colin Weigel and Paul Ferraro on the call, who bring obviously a lot of experimental design expertise, and were involved in some of the design at different stages. So they may want to offer some perspective as well from those early days.
Yeah, so do you want to, Sam? Do you want to follow up upon this, or shall we come to the next question or comment?
I'll just say it's a huge challenge getting enough statistical power, and it's too often ignored. If I asked you to guess, we just reviewed 4 years of the top ecology journals, including Science and Nature, and tried to estimate the median power. What would you guess it would be?
0.2. I guess 0.2.
Yeah, you're over by twofold. You've doubled the actual value.
Yeah.
But yet, despite that, there's an incredible number of statistically significant results in the ecology literature, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is part of the issue that you'd love to test more, but if you want to have some more credible ability to draw inferences, you've got to unfortunately test less.
Yeah.
So the answer is there wasn't the power was the problem.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It was
Yeah.
power.
Colin and I put our foot down.
Short answer is power.
The short answer is the power, but I guess the part of why I made a longer answer is that obviously it depends on your budget, right? And I will share one practical sort of lesson as someone who is sort of pitching this to funders and sponsors internally. I realized myself how it's very important to have people have realistic expectations about like what you can test, right? Because I think we started off with some of our sponsors, let's test everything. Like, okay, that's, so that is one of the trade-offs, obviously, of testing, is that you become more limited in what questions you can ask, but you can ask them more powerfully.
No, I suppose, look, I know there's no other hands up, so I'll take the opportunity. You could have done just A and then just B and then just C and had equivalent power. So my question is really about that specific design and why that one was the one that appealed to you most. I completely understand power, just,
Yeah, and that's what I was saying, is that adding the lease template to that third treatment was very low cost, and because we want to get some conservation results if we can, we thought, let's put both of those things together and see if we do actually get more out of it, while of course that sacrifices our ability to like disentangle those two.
Yeah, and if I can add on to that real quick, I mean, I don't think that we're struggling to test a bunch of programs that already we know work really well and then figure out what bits of that make them work. I think that there's a large problem with just not having something that is scalable, where we can see that, amongst randomized participants, those who actually get the treatment take up cover crops at a rate of 20 or 30%. So we did a follow-up study where we offered a lot more money. We could have scaled it and done incremental amounts and see how much money does it take, but we offered $5,000 for 40 acres of cover crops. It's an incredibly good rate, and yet we only got a 5% take-up rate. So if we're going to learn and fail fast, then just hitting it with everything we've got and saying, this is a program that could be scalable. Can we detect an effect? And then once we have 30% take up, go ahead, put a lot of money into it, break it down, and see what aspects of it are really contributing and what are most efficient and worth the cost. But as it is, we just don't see anything that's scalable, that has evidence that it works versus placebo.
Well said, Colin. And Colin is now moved on to the California Air Resources Board, where he is running experiments to help address climate change out there. So
yeah, thanks. I would like to move on, and the next person on my list is Anthony, who also has a question. Can you, yeah, you unmuted yourself, so.
Thank you. They're very interesting experiences. It's lovely to see these real world, you know, rather than just the nice polished final version of success. See the dirty stuff that goes on. It's partly a point of clarification. Was your economic question, was the literature actually saying, did I get this right, that it would increase the asset value of the farm?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I'm pausing because the message framing that we wanted to test is more the message framing that's been used in practice. And I think that you could question whether those messages are actually well supported by evidence. And I think that is part of why that economic message frame didn't do so well, is that this idea that these soil health practices do in fact increase the land asset value in the long term just didn't feel that credible to these people.
Oh, sorry, but so that was correct. It was about increasing the land asset value.
That was the message frame because, or the economic message, because it's one that is used in the soil health community around promoting conservation practices.
Sorry, the reason for my question is not that. I was listening to Mark Carney this morning talk about the concentration of costs and benefits in economic landscapes. And so as a very simple as, I mean, I rent this damn house and I could put in Italian marble countertops in my kitchen, thus dramatically increasing the value of the asset that I live in. But because I rent it, I don't, because I wouldn't really see the benefit. Now, it seems to me that when you state that you're increasing the asset value, that's potentially not speaking to the motivation of a renter. It's speaking to the motivation of an owner.
Thank you for that question. So two things. You got it exactly right. It's analogous to that issue of, when you are a renter of a home, you're not going to do improvements because you don't own the home. So I liked your example with the marble bathrooms or whatever it was. That's a good analogy. We were targeting the landowner who does own the asset. And so typically programs target the farm operator, and like you said, they don't have the incentive to invest in the asset in the long term because they don't own it. But we were saying, let's do something a little bit different, because these landowners should be able to benefit from conservation in the long term if it improves their land asset value. And so that's who we are speaking to.
Okay, thanks. The next question comes from the chat, and that's Mark Schwartz. Would you like to go ahead yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So at the beginning, you framed the study as considering both information spreading information amongst people to change behaviors, and economic incentives and nudging. At the end of the day, the experiment seems to focus more heavily on economics than the other two aspects of this. And I'm wondering if you thought about, or if you're now thinking about, other means that might move more people into the adoption group. So, for example, one of the things we seem to understand about human behavior is people pay attention to their neighbors. And if you concentrated your messaging and tried to get a clusters or nodules of success, you may get more people adopting, reach a tipping point and get more people adopting these measures because they see their neighbors doing it. And so some of these non-economic frames. So I'm wondering where you're going with your work from here, I guess. And by the way, very nicely done. Nice talk.
No, thank you. Thank you. Yes, so we did consider those things. There were, as you saw, there were 5 categories of barriers, and within that, there were many, many more. And so, not things around not the fact that people don't see other farmers doing this, that these are not perceived as good farming practices. They cover crops look like weeds. That was sort of a concern. However, for the non-operator landowners, they don't necessarily live on these farms, and so the idea of a social comparison seemed a little less relevant, because they're not necessarily like a social group who perceives each other as having some shared identity. Now, I think that might be an interesting thing to do with owner operators, but there's some real practical challenges around doing that as an experiment. And what I'll say is that we are part of a soil health partnership network of demonstration farms, where we pay willing farmers to do some of these practices, and then they do like field days with other farmers. And then at the same time, we're using those demonstration farms to advance our ability to actually measure and test those improvements in the soil and in the water. The challenge is that that's pretty hard to do as an experiment. And so instead, we've been doing more descriptive research and to look at the impacts of that.
I'll just add, it's not overwhelmingly challenging. That we've described how we could do it, and they didn't want to do it. Right? They didn't want to collect the information on who showed up at the demonstration, so that we can follow up and see if they've actually changed their behavior, that we could randomly encourage or incentivize some people. So, Mark, if that's it's one of those, social connections are like information. We know it influences behavior, but the idea we can leverage it for conservation hasn't been well documented, how to do that best. And you can find any partners that want to do it, or actually want to try to test that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's, if I look around the Nature Conservancy, the idea, it is a very common practice for us to identify these sort of leaders, innovators, champions, and support them, promote them, help them communicate out into their community. But there's maybe in part because it is such a core part of our strategy, there's been a little less willingness to want to experiment with it. But we have a few instances where we have been doing that, and also taking advantage of remote sensing data or spatial data to do sort of like diffusion and network analyses.
Yeah, and if I can add, there are 2 things that make it a real challenge. I mean, we could have done our design in a similar way and clustered it at community levels. That wouldn't be hard to do in terms of randomization and evaluation. But the statistical power drops because now you have clusters rather than individuals. So the amount of money it would take to do it is enormous. And then also, when we're thinking about this exchange of social information, especially when it's just observations of what's down the road, it takes so much time, because can we get 2 people to do it in a community this year? And okay, now that there are 2, then a couple other people see it, so it grows over time. But are we waiting 10 years to say whether it's successful or not, or make some determination about evaluation? Whereas the project that we did could be evaluated in a very short period of time, because there's just a single year. So I think it's a really interesting question, really important, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And as Paul noted, the logistics of getting people to show up at things and record it, we looked into doing that, and we didn't have the capability to do it. These are people over a very large geographic area, and coordinating that was too much of a challenge for the scope of our project.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for clarifying this. Now we turn to Richard.
Thank you. I think Mark probably nicked my question, but I'll try it anyway. And there's also an observation. So I'm in a large, for the UK, conservation NGO, which, as Andrew knows, in the past has been rather paralysed from trying to use behavioural insight to inform its practice. It's changing a bit, but it's great to see the biggest conservation NGO now embracing behaviour science. So that's really great. I would share the observation. I'm staggered at the lack of inspection of whether economic or utilitarian framing compared to other framing makes a difference. So I'm really glad that you're looking at that. And I guess as a follow-up, and this is where I think Mark might have stolen my thunder, given some of the results that you've got, have you thought about trying some dynamic norm framing or using different messengers to see if you can get even greater pickup now in the next phases?
Well, no, is the short answer. So essentially where we're at right now is this was supported by innovation funds, and now these funds are completed, but the teams that are working on this have taken some of the insights and are integrating some more experiments into what they're doing, not necessarily at the scale that we have, but the strategic communications team is doing more messaging and not necessarily as randomized controlled trials, but trying to use some, I might call it like business analytics to gain some insights and do more A/B testing sort of things. And we actually are supposed to be talking again soon, so I don't have an answer for you at this moment about all the new messages that they're testing, but I will suggest some of these for them to explore. And it has actually been pretty neat to me to see that when I look at our work, I think often when we think about conservation, we think about doing experiments around changes that are happening, for lack of a better word, I'll say on the ground. But I think some of our bigger opportunities to do tests are actually in our strategic communications and engagements, because we can the time frame for getting feedback is a lot faster, and we can take advantage of digital media, essentially.
I do think it's worth considering the messenger effect. We experience that. Nobody's going to hear you if they're not listening. So can you use other people to convey your messages? And I do think dynamic norms are worth thinking about. The more I've looked at dynamic norms, more and more people are doing this, even if they're not necessarily looking over the fence at their neighbour, especially with the scale of farms that you've got. Mm-hmm. That could be quite powerful as an option. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing the ideas.
Richard, do you have context for people doing it in conservation, where you have to be able to observe the land use to be able to create the dynamic norm?
That I don't know. I was thinking of other domains. As you know, the work we've done with Christian, it just feels that dynamic norms is something that hasn't really been explored yet, but when people explored it, it's been quite powerful. So it might not be a starter, but I think it'd be worth exploring the literature to think whether it might apply in this case.
Yeah, I agree.
So we come to Andrew now.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that talk. I really enjoyed it. Just a couple of quick things. I mean, on the back of the problem that you've got, that these people these farms are very important for your problem, but the owners don't seem to be particularly amenable to what you're trying to do. I was wondering, one, whether there were any, using Josh Sinner's language, bright spots out there, exceptional responders amongst that pool who are doing anything that you can learn from. And second, whether there's anything you can do with the renters, so not the landowners, but the people who are renting.
I could probably offer some responses to that, but I am seeing Linda Prokofy nodding her head, and so I might offer that she give a response. And perhaps Pranay as well. Linda, would you like to respond to that question?
Sure, I can start. We actually heard during the work, right, we got some feedback from renters. Don't go to my landowner, you should come to me. And and certainly that's the approach that's always been tried, right? That's the traditional approach. But the traditional approach is going to the renter and just saying you should adopt this practice. It's not giving the renter tools to talk to their landowner, right? So the NRCS, the U.S. federal agency, has a handout for tenants on how to talk to your landowner, but it's not very engaging, right? It's not actively encouraging the renter to talk to their landowner and what kind of language to use and how to do that. So I do think that's the next step of this is, we found some ways to reach landowners, but we still didn't reach a lot of landowners, right? Does it make more sense to go through the tenants? And I think that's certainly work that needs to be done to look at that more carefully and see, can we get those conversations to happen by going the opposite direction?
Mm-hmm.
And this is Pranay. Linda mentioned, very, very truly, this idea of how can we leverage? We have greater access to renters. So how do we actually leverage that, sort of lever to have more conservation on rented land? I think going back, Andrew, to a question about success stories, one thing that I definitely recollect is a landowner from New York area coming over to Indiana, who owns land in Indiana, stopping by in our office, having a conversation, like equipping himself with all the information that he needs to then have a conversation with his sister, and then creating sort of that groundwork before they feel that they have, all the moving pieces, all the information figured out to actually initiate that conversation. So I feel like it did lead to a lot of initial traction of, okay, let's try and make this happen. But again, adopting cover crop is not a one-shot game. I mean, you got to keep doing it year after year. So that's one aspect. And then given that there are so many moving pieces, often you have multiple family members that have to be on board before you can actually push something. So I feel like there have definitely been some success stories. Whether they are, they can be scaled is a question that we still need to sort of, figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have only 2 more minutes remaining and 2 more hands up. So at this point, I would highly appreciate short questions, short answers to give the 2 remaining persons who want to ask a question also a chance to get their things discussed. Next one would be Lauren.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'll just be really quick. I have to drop at 12, so I have a couple of minutes. I was wondering if you received any pushback from message manipulation from extension staff or faculty, just with the concept of, maybe not being as straightforward with your landowners or the renters as you would have liked.
So I see Linda shaking her head no. I will say we did have one instance during the project where there was a little bit of action on an online chat where some farmers saying, watch out, the Nature Conservancy is talking to your landowner, trying to get them to do something. And, it definitely gave us a lot of concern because, we tried to be transparent and be a trusted partner. And so, a science-based, advocate for conservation. And so, while we obviously wanted to test these things, and that means you might have different messages in different places, we did always try to be clear, that this is coming from us. We weren't hiding who it was coming from. And, if anyone did want to come to ask us about what we were doing, we were certainly willing to share it. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thanks.
Okay, so we have Vivek.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Vivek from India. I'm a research fellow from an organization called MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. I work exactly on cover crops. Now we are in the first phase where we are studying the ethnopedology and the ethno-ecological understanding of farmers, where we work with the smallholder farmers. So here the problem is we work in an arid system where farmers are already marginal in their income. How to make them like take up the cover cropping practice is a very difficult challenge. Here, the exciting thing I learned from your presentation is understanding the relationship between the landowner and renter. So, is this field is this dimension of investigation is new, or it's been done for so many years from the last few decades? Whether is it really possible landowners will be willing to share expenses for conservation activities? Do you think it is really possible?
Yeah, great question. We, based on what we've learned, we think there is a subpopulation of landowners who would be interested in sharing costs with their operator to do these types of practices. And that's part of what we were trying to encourage with the lease template. Well, obviously, we didn't show a big difference with that. We did get some indication through other parts of the research that there is a subpopulation. So, I think we, at the start of this, made an intentional decision to kind of look at the landowner, non-operator landowner population in general. However, I could imagine, future phases trying to focus in on specific subpopulations that might be, more oriented towards sustainability. And some of the at least in the US, farmland management companies are targeting those people who maybe have inherited farmland, but maybe live near a big city and are a bit younger, care about doing good.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so thanks a lot to all of you. I think it's time to conclude our little seminar today. A huge thank you to you, Sheila, for presenting your paper and also a little bit everything which comes with it. Thanks a lot also to all of you joining. I think we had a great discussion also, and I hope that we all now move on with our tasks in an inspired way. Please join me in a kind of virtual applause for Sheila. So there are these nice little features included in Zoom, or you can also do it in a traditional way. So goodbye, thank you, and hopefully we meet again sometime for another one of these virtual seminars.
Thank you. And don't
Mark, you want to have some last words maybe also?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you again, everyone, for being here. And we are trying to do more of these sorts of efforts. We have increasing leadership support at the Nature Conservancy for this. And it really does take people like you with expertise, good questions to help us out. So, stay in touch. And we hope to be able to tap into the brain trust represented here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.